Tales of Khayaal is a set of stories that look to really address the question that what does it mean to be human in a time of tremendous techno-scientific change?
Welcome to Fantasy and Faith, episode 12 in season 2. Today I'm joined by Rehan Khan, a professor of leadership, thought leader on AI and the future of work, a Carnegie-nominated author of historical fiction, fantasy, and science fiction novels. His books include the Das Burai trilogy, A Tudor Turk, which is part of a series as well, and he's currently working on Tales of Khayaal. Brother Rehan, can you introduce yourself a bit more to the audience, please?
Yeah, thank you so much, Noor, and Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for all of you joining. So, yeah, I think you've kind of just introduced me very nicely there, and I'm someone who's always worked. I worked for about 30 years in the corporate sector, but as an artist, I was always doing things outside the corporate sector. So, yeah, you need to pay the bills, right? But then you have some artistic endeavors outside. So, I was always dabbling in writing of different types, whether it was writing newspaper articles, was writing film scripts or writing novels. So I kept that kind of passion going outside. And then I do a little bit of teaching as well. So I teach postgraduate students as well. So these days I'm a bit more relaxed. I don't need to work in the corporate sector anymore. So I can give more time to those artistic pursuits. But yeah, thank you.
I think I should call you back to have a discussion on leadership as well, because I'm also a leadership trainer as well.
Yeah.
So I did my master's in community leadership. So I think we've got a lot of similarities and overlapping areas there.
Well, maybe we can do something about leadership in fantasy novels at some point. Who are the leaders in the Tolkien universe or the Brandon Sanderson universe, and we could go into that one maybe some other time.
Maybe, inshallah. So what got you reading in the first place and writing? So what was that spark that really got into you and said, yes, I want to be a writer?
Well, interestingly, when I was like many people, when I was at school, I had a very inspirational teacher, and I was like 9 at the time. And I remember this is going back to 1980, and I grew up in London, in Wimbledon, in South London, and we had an American exchange teacher, and she really encouraged me to write. So I ended up writing a story in 1980 about a friend of mine, close friend of mine, Andrew, who basically his parents went on holiday, and they forgot to take him. And poor old Andrew gets left at home, and these burglars are trying to break into his house, and he sets all these traps for them everywhere, right? And now, of course, that sounds like Home Alone, which came out in the mid 80s. Now, my teacher, she was from Beverly Hills, California, so she was from the home of Hollywood, right? Now, I don't know, but did my story end up becoming the film, the treatment for Home Alone? I could never prove that. But anyway, that was why I really kind of was very, got into writing when I was young. And then, like many people, you grow up and, you go to university and work, and you kind of stop doing all that kind of stuff. And then fast forward many years, back in 2009, I think it was, my daughter, who was 6 at the time, she said to me, Abu, she said, Daddy, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was at the time like a executive, a COO for a company. And I thought, I always wanted to be a writer. That's what I wanted to do. So that was the spark that reignited an old flame, really. And so I think from around 2009, I started taking it very seriously and thinking about, okay, what am I doing this? Why am I doing it? What's the intention? What's the purpose? And that kind of led me down the last kind of path for the last 15, 16 years of, putting out about 8 novels and a bunch of other things as well.
And how did you meet Peter Gould, your co-creator on the Tales of Khayaal?
Yeah, so that was an interesting story because Peter had been working on this concept of Tales of Khayaal for a couple of years, and he was developing it as a kind of comic book and sort of did some gaming stuff around it. And he got to a point where, he realized that he actually needed more lore, LORE, and more narrative. And we had a friend in common. And this friend of mine knew what I was some of the stuff I was working on, and he knew what some of the stuff Peter was working on, and he kind of connected us very kindly. And he said, "Look, I really think you two working together is going to make a good combination." And so I think it was in December 2022 when Peter called me and said, "Look, I've read your Tudor Turk series, which was essentially a series set in the Ottoman Empire and Tudor England in 1591." And he said, "I really like your style of writing. Would you like to write Tales of Khayaal novels?" I was like, okay, I hadn't really thought about this. I was finishing another book called Tomb of Empires, which was set in Palestine, Syria, and Jordan in 90 BC, and that came out last year. And I was kind of partway through that, and I said to Peter, "Well, if you don't mind waiting until May June time, then we can talk. Because right now I'm right in the middle of this novel. I can't do anything. I don't want to take my mind off it." And Peter very kindly said, "Yeah, no, I'll wait. I'll wait. I want to work with you. I'll wait." So move forward from December 2022 to the summer of 23. Then I went over to Sydney. So I'm based in Dubai. I was in Malaysia anyway. We went to Sydney, and then we spent a week together in Peter's studio down there, really ideating, coming up with, what is the world? What is the story? What are we trying to do? And one of the things that was really important for us was intentionality and just setting the intention at the start. That as artists, we were, through our art, trying to get closer to God, right? Through the art that we do. And then maybe the people who read the book or who listen to the book, maybe they will also remember, the creator, through that process. So that was the intention, and it was very important to anchor the intention in that, rather than yeah, this we the intention is to make a movie or get really famous, whatever. Because the outcome is not down to us, right? The means is down to us. So as long as we focus on the means and be in the moment, the outcome is down to God. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. So I think there was a lot of discussion on intention, and really writing it down in our kind of lore. So our internal lore document starts with a whole page on intention, and then we moved to the lore. So we started building a lot of that at the time. And what is this world? And when you build a fantasy novel, as you know, there are many like parts to it, right? There's a setting, what's happening there. There's all the characters, what are their issues, and then there's the plot and what kind of plot do you want to design. So we went through all of that at a high level. So that's how it really got started. The whole kind of process, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to unpick in what you just. I mean, you've covered a lot just in that. So, when you writing your historical novels, what is your approach to your research?
Yeah, so I've done four historic fiction. So just take the last one as an example, which was called Tomb of Empires, and I said set in 90 BC. It's kind of pre-Christianity, and it's a story about that set in Middle East region when there was the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, which were really controlling the region. Now, most people, if you say to them, "Have you heard of the Romans?" they'll say yes. "Have you heard of the Ptolemaic Empire, Seleucid Empire?" They'll say no, never heard of them. But they were actually around for about 250 years. Okay, and then on the east side you had the Han Chinese, and then across the Hijaz and the Arabian Peninsula you had the Nabateans, who would take the spice from Aden and from Mocha. So it would come from the east. It would go there, and of course, Mocha was the coffee, capital of the world, where all the coffee comes from later. And they would take the spices from Aden and Mocha up to Gaza, to Gaza, and from Gaza it would go across the Mediterranean. So these were the four kind of powers. You had the Han Chinese, you had the Nabateans controlling spice, and you had these two Western Greek powers, the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic Empire, vying for. So the research, to answer your question, was, well, first of all, I had to read the academic books on these people. Right? Like, who were they? Like the Seleucids, for example. One really interesting thing I found about them: they were called the Elephant Lords, and I thought that's weird. They're originally, these Seleucius was a general of Alexander. I mean, when Alexander the Great dies in about 330 or something, then Seleucus and Ptolemy, his two generals, they establish empires, and they're called the Elephant Lords. And it's a really interesting story because they marched their armies to the Hindu Kush in the Himalayas, and way back in 200 and something BC, they then met the armies of the Mauryan Indian Empire, Chandragupta Maurya, who was the emperor of India, and the two armies kind of like sized each other up, big battlefield. The historical records say 100,000 on either side. It means a big number. It might be 1,000. It might be 10,000. It was a big number, and they size each other up, and they think this is going to be pretty bloody. I tell you what, let's just do a truce. And what they do, they have some princesses and princes from either side. They get married, and then Chandragupta Maurya, the emperor of India, he then gives elephants to the Seleucids. All right, and then they take the elephants back, and they build an elephant training center in what is today in Turkey. And then when Jerusalem is sacked by the Seleucids in 165 BC by Emperor Antiochus IV, he uses elephants to sack Jerusalem, to destroy the Temple Mount, right? And that's why they were called elephant lords. But you'd think, because there's no elephants in Europe, right? So why are they called elephant lords, right? So there are little interesting things when you go into the academic books of each of these empires that you discover. So that, I think, is really how I start when I'm doing a historic fiction. I first go into the deep academic journals, books, so that I can be as genuine to the empires and really understand what's happening at a social level, political level, economic level, because so much of the world history is a history of trade, right? How goods and services have moved around the world. And as trade has happened, how ideas have moved, how culture there's been a cultural exchange. So a lot of it is really understanding that. And then once you know the setting, okay, this is the world. All right, so who do I want to put into this world? Okay, I want to put these characters into this world. All right, okay, what are those challenges of those characters? And then you start from there. So the research is probably, for historic fiction, for me, it's about 30% of my total effort of producing the book.
How do you handle actual historical figures? So do you treat them as extras, or do you have them as a part of your cast of characters?
I try not to make them the protagonists, at least. I might make them an antagonist. So one of the emperors in the last novel, he was the emperor at the time, and he's kind of one of the antagonists in this. But he doesn't turn up very often, but he does turn up sometimes. So I think I try not to make them the main character, but it'll be people around them. So, for example, if ever, and I don't think I'd be the right person, but if ever I was writing a book on, say, Salahuddin Ayyubi, I probably wouldn't tell it from Salahuddin's perspective. I might write it from someone close to Salahuddin, because just out of respect for that individual, that main character.
So, coming back to your collaborations with Peter, um, how do you align your creative instincts? Because I mean, Peter's a creative, so he's going to have his opinion and perspective. You're a creative, you've got your opinions and style and your perspectives. How do you marry that all together, and how does that bring together the spiritual heart of Tales of Khayaal?
Yeah, really good question. So the way we see it is that to produce a novel and to get it out to the world, there are two aspects. There's the craft of it, and then there's the art of it. So I see myself as the craftsperson, right? So my job as a wordsmith is to go through word by word, put the building blocks in place, right? So I've got to do the craft, right? Just as any stone worker, a mason, a tile worker, a calligrapher would do that. But then there's the art of telling the story, which is really, once the story is done, how do you communicate that story to the world? And how do you communicate it in a medium that the world will connect with, right? Because you've got the message and you have the medium, right? So you might have a great message, but if you can't use the right medium, you won't get it out there. And what Peter's really good at, he's really good at the art, right? of that kind of, of that vision, of that connection, of how can I enliven, how can I inspire, how can I, connect with people, which is the art side of it. So I think, we kind of stay in our work packages, to use more of a corporate term. We stay in our work packages, or if you're a swimmer, you stay in your swim lane, right? But we're always like, we're speaking to each other every week, a couple of times a week. He's bouncing ideas off me, I'm bouncing ideas off him. But we know that, okay, the buck stops with me when it comes to the craft of the novel, and the buck stops with Peter when it comes to the art of the novel. And so I think that's how we, at a high level, that's how we break it down.
Is it more challenging to work with somebody else's characters and world rather than building your own from scratch?
Well, I think if you look at the original concept for Tales of Khayaal and what it is today, it's probably like 95% different. So it was, and Peter was very generous when we started speaking about this, and he said to me, "Look, change whatever you want to change." so so it's something that, together we built it, right? So I don't feel like it's been imposed on me. Like, if someone said to me, "Oh, here's a Star Wars story, can you write this?" Right? Then there's a lot of imposition about, the universe and the emperor and the light and dark side and the whole kind of Manichaean universe of how Star Wars is set up. You have to stick within that, but this wasn't the case. This is very much like, we built it together.
And what were your major influences? So I know that you've talked a bit about Star Wars and Lord of the Rings before. How much of that literary or cinematic or even spiritual sources of information have helped you shape the world of Khayyal?
Yeah, so if I look at myself in terms of my kind of creative input into that, there's probably four or five different aspects. One is, I think, more literary aspects. So I love some of the great, literary classics from around the world. So whether it's from the Chinese tradition, something like, Journey to the West, a more classical tale from the 16th century, or the more recent kind of Jin Yong, kind of wushu kung fu style stories. Yeah, I love reading those. If you look at some of the Persian classics, like The Conference of the Birds, for example, by Farid al-Attar, or you look at some of the Russian novels like Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, several works by Tolstoy, for instance, or some of the English classics, whether it's by Jane Austen or Dickens, I'm kind of really like, in that world. Yeah. So I really enjoy those kind of books. I really enjoy reading those books. At the same time, I've kind of, read a lot of fantasy in my time as well. Whether it's the Tolkien style or the C.S. Lewis, or in more recent years, kind of like Brandon Sanderson, people like that who are kind of really versed in creating lore and mythology. So I've got a lot of that influence probably into my writing. And then as kind of a amateur historian, I'm always reading, different histories. So, for example, one of the things in Tales of Khayal is the collapse of an empire called Aron after an organization called the Syndicate turns up, and they start to essentially asset strip this empire. Right now, to understand how that works, I was reading William Dalrymple's book, The Anarchy, which is how the East India Trading Company eventually, took over India, really, from the Mughals. And so that, as a historic piece, was really, really helpful for me, right? So my reading of history, and academic books, history books, have a lot of influence on everything I'm writing. I like this quite a lot. If I go back, though, probably to my earlier time, then I was real kind of like avid comic collector. So I was really into comics in a big way. I was, mainly, and interestingly, I came to comics through detective stories. So when I was reading detective stories, whether it was, the Sherlock Holmes or something else from Agatha Christie, for example, I love the fact that these kind of characters could really sleuth out and figure out, and outwit the bad guys, right? And so when I was then going into comics, I was thinking, well, which characters do that? And there's really only one character, right? That is a detective, okay, or the world's greatest detective, who is Batman, of course. So I connected with Batman straight away, right? Because This guy, it's not just like Biff Baff, he actually he uses his brain, right? He's a chemist. He's expert in language and cryptography. He's done his hard hours of study. And so I never liked the kind of Adam West '60s kind of kapow Batman. I was like, this is not Batman, right? And even the Tim Burton kind of Batman, to me that was more film noir. It wasn't really Batman, and it was really a Christopher Nolan series where you actually see the Christian Bale character using his brain and figuring things out. That to me was okay. Now they've got the Batman that I had envisaged when I first approached it. Now, back in the '80s and '90s, it was really difficult to get a good, regular supply in the UK of comics, and there weren't many places. I lived in London, so I was very fortunate that near Tottenham Court Road, there's a little road there called Neal Street, and on Neal Street there was a comic shop called Comic Showcase, and it was a real like you know you wouldn't no one knew about it unless you needed to know about it, right? So I would spend many hours in Comic Showcase, boosting my connection of Batman, Detective Comics, and Dark Knight and so on. And of course, I would read others as well. Whether it's with a Spider-Man or Daredevil or Punisher and so on, but they never really, or Thor, but they never really did it for me like the Batman series did. So from that, I was always the influence there was the fact that you had a character who was using their brain, right? And so even watching the Incredible Hulk series from the '80s with Bill Bixby, right? I preferred it when he was Dr. Banner rather than when he became the Hulk, because Hulk was just like Hulk smash, right? Whereas Dr. Banner was like he was again, the human story and the struggles and so on. So I was always influenced by those kind of sources, I guess. Some more great literature, some history, some comics, and then in terms of the Islamic kind of narratives that I guess that influenced me, which you're asking. If you look into our tradition, then there are books like, for example, Hay ibn Yaqsan by Ibn Tufail from the 12th century, and it's about a man who grows up on a desert island, and it's a philosophical novel about could you discover God if no one taught you religion, right? Um, a beautiful story, and when that gets translated several hundred years later into the European languages, that leads to Daniel Defoe writing Robinson Crusoe. Yes, and so Robinson Crusoe's direct influence is Hay ibn Yaqsan from the 12th century. And so reading books like The Conference of the Birds by Farid Al-Attar, again, a wonderful metaphor about the journey of the human soul, back to God through the parable of these different birds who go on this, great journey. So I think those were always influences from our Islamic kind of Muslim tradition, because we have a great literary tradition, right? And then you had books like maybe more in the fantasy, but with a religious kind of coloring to them, which would of course be something like C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia, or his like Screw Tape Letters, which are very interesting. Um, and I guess Tolkien from in the Silmarillion, because the Silmarillion is really the creation story, right? Whereas Lord of the Rings is the addendum to the Silmarillion, whereas the Silmarillion is the main story. And Tolkien is very much, he says he's not into allegory. He says he's very much into history, and he says that he wanted to tell the story of the fall of man's descent, and then going on to this island of Numenor, and eventually Numenor being destroyed, which is like the Atlantis story. And of course, the survivors of Numenor, then we see them in the Lord of the Rings, and Aragorn is one of those from that lineage, right? So those kind of stories where you have these grand epics, where there's religion, but not in your face religion, but it's there. Those kind of stories have always appealed to me. So really, there's quite a lot of like any writer, there's a lot of influences that I would have to give credit to.
So how do you bring in the Islamic narrative then? Because you've mentioned Tolkien's method of focusing on history as well. even though he doesn't do allegory, those themes, the themes are there. So, how
Yeah.
have you brought in Islamic narratives into Tales of Khayal and your previous writing as well?
Yeah. So look, I think when we say Islamic narratives, I think what we're trying to tell a human story about really about connection. Okay, and so it's about how do we connect with the divine, right? Now, in every single tradition, including our tradition, okay, um, every kind of tradition, I guess, faith-based tradition, we believe that humans have always tried to understand their place in the world through a story that they tell themselves. Like, this is who I am, this is where I'm going, right? Now, when that story has some kind of transcendence, like when it's going somewhere and you're transcending to something else, then that's a really hopeful story, right, to hold on to, right? But if you just believe that this world is it, there's nothing else, that can be quite depressing, right? So most of the world's kind of traditional belief systems, whether they are from the East, Confucianist and Taoist and Buddhist, or if you look at some of the old traditions from the West, such as the Native American Indians, right? Then all these traditional belief systems, they believe in this notion of transcendence, of moving beyond the physical into the metaphysical. So if I was going to say the Islamic influence was there, it was in that light, right? So it's the fact that we are beings who have been placed into the world, but we are essentially spiritual beings. We are souls on the journey back to God. So that's the kind of the coloring in the story, but it doesn't go beyond that. I'm not going to say this is an Islamic story or this is a Christian story. That I mean, I don't think readers will really appreciate that. But if there's a subtlety in there, and just if you see when in the Silmarillion, the very first page of the Silmarillion, how does Tolkien open up? He talks about uh, um, how Arda was created, this world called Arda, right? Which some people say maybe is from the Arabic Ard. Who knows? Anyway, and but he says that in the beginning, Iluvata, the creator, God, Iluvata, he creates the Ainur, the angels, and then he teaches them how to sing, and then the story starts. So he basically has got this whole kind of lore to the world he's creating. So in the sense that we would use any ideas from the Islamic tradition, it would be in that way. That's what we're doing, right? And then it comes down to really how are we layering the story, right? Because if you think about it, a great, well, any book that's hopefully worth reading will have like four different levels. You'll have the literal level, which is, it's a page turner, it's the plot, like what happens, this happens, that happens, that happens. And then you've got the allegorical level, which is the kind of, what's the writer really saying? What's really going on. So if you read Animal Farm by George Orwell, it's about some animals taking over a farm, but actually it's about the Russian Revolution. So that's the allegory. So we, unlike Tolkien, we do allegory. We're into allegory, right? So this story, in terms of Tales of Khayaal, it's around two principal ideas. One is the loss of sacred knowledge. That's something we're writing about in an allegorical way, because every generation can actually forget what came before it, and then it gets to a point where no one even knows that we had that sacred knowledge, right? So the sacred knowledge could be the knowledge of how to the ecology of the earth and how to keep that in balance. That's sacred knowledge, right? Sacred knowledge could be around the creating a particular art piece. Sacred knowledge could be about religion, right? It could be in different things. But so one thing is about losing sacred knowledge, right? That's what we're talking about, the allegorical level. And the second thing is that there is a commentary on colonialism as well, and the impact of colonialism on traditions and so on. So that's kind of allegorical level. And then the third level, I guess, of any novel that's worth reading, there should be some kind of moral level, moral questions, because what you do as a novelist, you put the characters into moral dilemmas, right? You put them into difficult situations. And what is a moral question? As you know, from a leadership perspective, a moral question is, what should I do? Yeah, what should I do? Should I be magnanimous and generous, or should I not? And that's a moral question. But the interesting thing is, to answer a moral question, you have to think a bit deeper, which is you have to think about your what virtue is it connected to? And virtues are questions of what kind of person should I be? So moral questions, what should I do? And virtues are about what kind of person should I be? And that's then connected to your belief system, right? So there's a moral level of a novel, and what we're doing is we're putting characters into morally difficult situations and seeing what happens. And then there's the fourth level of the novel, which is the kind of the spiritual level, which is the more kind of eschatological arc of the story, which is, where is this whole thing going, right? How is this transcending, where are things going? And that then is where you might want to bring in a very deep, a very subtle message. So, in a previous novel, Tomb of Empires, well, actually, in the Tales of Khayaal series, which was the Ottoman series, that kind of spiritual, deeper question was around qadr, or what we call predestination. Do I have a choice, or is everything predestined, right? That was the kind of the essence of the story. Whereas in Tomb of Empires, my last novel, it was about something that we call, which is marifa. And marifa is about, how do I know God? Is he far away? Is he close by? Like, where is he? How do I know him? Right. And so that was the question that some of the characters were struggling with. And in Tales of Khayaal, it's really about, can you redeem yourself? Yeah. Like, it doesn't matter what someone's done. Is there a way back? And of course, again, in our tradition, we believe that there is the doorway to Toba, to repentance, is always open, right? As long as your heart is genuine, you can come back. And so, from a character perspective, what that means, it's not how the character begins, but how does the character end, right? And that's what we're kind of exploring with this as well.
So one of my issues has been with people who claim their books as being Muslim fiction, or even going as far as calling it Islamic fiction, is the question of morality within the characters. So I think um, your main protagonist should be a moral character who makes moral decisions, because that's the kind of influence that you want people to go away with. But if they do something immoral, that there should be either a feeling of guilt and the need for some form of redemption, to do tawbah, as we just discussed, and also some form of punishment. So unless they seek redemption, that there should be some ill consequence of their actions. And I think that's kind of a central theme of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy al Munkar,
Mm.
tell people to do right and stop them from doing wrong, that I don't see in a lot of fiction that's coming out at the moment by Muslim writers, that I
Yeah.
think needs to be there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think so. Look, I think it's up to us to really define some of the principles and some of the values that we want to write about, and some of the virtues we want. I prefer to use the word virtue rather than value. Some of the things that we really want to write about, rather than trying to copy and just trying to do what others have done, but just putting like an Aladdin twist to it or something. That's, why are we doing that? You're literally wasting your time by doing that. Be genuine to your
Next
tradition.
book, by the way.
So I think there what we need to do is we need to really think about, what do we believe, right? And I think a lot of us have to ask ourselves the question, what do I believe? What is my purpose, right? And when you ask those deeper existential questions, right, then as an artist, you think about, okay, well, how do I convey this in my story, right? Now, if of course you're just doing a story which is like, like a Western story, but with a kind of a few mosques and a few things inside it, okay, that's fine. That might be good for you to practice, right? But it's probably not the book you want to be known for, right? Or probably when you get to your old age, it's probably not the book you want to be most remembered by, right? So you have to really think about that. And I think, like, when I did my first three novels, Tasbirai series, I mean, they were self-published, and my intention back then was very much, okay, these books are going to get really well known, red carpet. I can see the movie, blah blah blah. My intention was wrong, right? My intention was wrong. And then I remember in Dubai, I was interviewing Brandon Sanderson, and he was just there at the time promoting his Knights Radiant series. And it was at the Emirates Literature Festival where I was moderating that year. And we were just talking, and then afterwards he said something once we'd finished with the audience, and it just prompted me to think about my intention. And he's quite a devout Christian, a Mormon Christian, and it just prompted me to question my intention. Like, why was I doing this, right? And so I went away, had a very deep thought, thinking about that. What is my intention? I reorientated my niyyah, my intention, to make it that okay, let my art be something that allows me to draw closer to God. I changed intention. And then within about 6 to 9 months, I got a publishing contract with a UK publisher, Hope Road, and they took on the three book series, right? But it just showed to me that how important intention is, and aligning that. So and starting with that, why am I doing this, right? And the great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, um, he wrote he led a very bohemian life early on, and he became quite a pious Christian at the end of it. And of course, his last work of fiction is called Haji Murad, which is quite an interesting tale about a Caucasian freedom fighter. But his last work of nonfiction is called What is Art? What is art? And in the book, he talks a lot about how, in his time in the 19th century, artists were seeking fame, fortune, influence, and he really criticized them. He said, "Look, there is only one role of the artist: to remind themselves of God and to remind others of God." And if you travel throughout the Muslim world, whether you go to the great mosques or the great institutions, and you look at the architecture, you look at the design, there's only one thing. You go, mashallah, mashallah, like you remember God, right? So it's really for us as Muslim writers and any writers of any faith tradition, it's for us to recapture why are we doing this, right? Why are we doing this? And once we start doing that and thinking about it, then I think you'll see the change in the stories, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay. How do you strike a balance then? I mean, because we've talked a lot about how we try to embrace Islam within our writing. How do you balance that out with making it appealing to people who are not Muslim or who come from other traditions or agnostic or atheistic? How do we make it accessible to a more diverse audience?
Yeah, I think, look, good literature has always sought to answer the question of what it means to be human across time, right? And this means basically addressing the challenges that humans have faced at any time. And if you think about what are the big questions that humans have always been struggling with, they've been struggling with purpose and God and peace and love and war and honor and fate. These are big questions, whether you live in now or whether you lived thousands of years ago. Same questions, right? And if you look at literature, take, for example, the Iliad by Homer. Now, the Iliad is about many things, but one of the things it's about fate and free will. Do I have a choice or don't I have a choice, right? Now, today, if you think about it, we live in the age of AI or AI algorithms, and they've been accused of manipulating us. So how much free will do you really have, right? So do you see it's the same human question that was in the 8th century BC as it is in now at our time, but it's in a different disguise, but it's the same human question. Or you take something like Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, which is about juxtaposing how one sister deals with issues and the other one is like overly sensitive. You just have to go to online forums and see people like raging against each other and like being highly sensitive all the time, right? So what literature does, it addresses the human condition. And so as a faith-based writer, what you must do first and foremost is you must address the human condition. And then it doesn't matter if someone is agnostic, doesn't believe in God, or any faith, because you will touch their heart, because they'll say, Yeah, I felt that. I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. And then if you put in a little bit of a coloring of a particular faith, a Buddhist or Islamic, it's okay. It's all right, because you've connected at a human level. They get it. I understand that. You look at again things like Star Wars. I mean, it's a made up religion, right? The Jedi, right? But people connect with it, and there are people who take it really seriously, and they dress like Jedi, and they go around like Jedi, right? And they and or the Klingon language in Star Wars, in Star Trek, forgive me. The people who learned the whole language, right? They take it really seriously because you've given them some kind of purpose, right? You've given them something. Now, of course, people of faith, Noor, what you and I would do is we would say, what a lot of these people who are chasing after stars and famous people who are mashhur, what they're really chasing for and what they're really looking for is they're really looking for God, right? But they just haven't articulated it, right? So I think we have to, as writers, have to be very responsible. We have to connect at a human level, and then maybe you present a few ideas, and people want to ignore it. They ignore it. That's okay, but if they want to embrace it, then maybe they do that as well.
So that comes up with that. There's a question I like to ask my guests when they come on my show is what are your writing rituals? So how do you get into the right mindset to write?
Yeah. So look, rituals are very important, right? In writing, really, really important. I think someone said, "Great creative minds think like artists, but work like accountants." So great creative minds think like artists, but work like accountants. And what that means is that when you have a set of rituals around you, it minimizes the friction of getting into flow, right? Because when you're in that flow state, um, then time and space disappears. The late Harvard professor Mihai Csikszentmihalyi wrote a book called Flow, and he talks a lot about this, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so he says that when people were in that flow state, the artists particularly, they felt like something was flowing through them, right? And they weren't interested in the outcome. It was just the experience of it, of course. Now, in our tradition, what we would say, we would call that a hal, right? We would say they are in a hal, right? And so when you get yourself into that hal, you are opening yourself, hopefully, if your intention is right, you are opening yourself to the divine breezes that may or may not come in your direction, right? But if they come, you are a receptacle at that point and you are open, and when they come, that flows through you. So rituals are really important to get there quickly. When I started writing my writing journey back in 2009, I think it was, then it would take me about 45 minutes to get to a flow state. It would really hard, like put on some, like background music or do this, do that, whatever, and just try and get into. And of course, I had a daytime job, so by the time I'm into flow, I've stopped another 45 minutes later. But then just the practice of it, and having a ritual, same place, pretty much most of the time to write, same time of day, right? Same slot, same kind of breakfast routine, sleeping routine. Okay, as much ritual in the build up. Now I could normally get into flow state within about 3-4 minutes. Like I'm just there, right? And if you look at the athletes, someone running the 100 meters, right? The 100 meters is the end performance, right? But it's the 100 hours of preparation they've done to get to the 10 seconds, right? So with a novelist, what you're doing is the novel is the end product, but no one sees all the work you've done, and they don't need to see it. But if you haven't done that work beforehand, the novel's not going to be very good. It's not worth reading, right? So that to me is the ritual is part of that. And of course, in our tradition, you don't just go and stand on the prayer mat and start to pray. First, you have to do the wudu, the ablution, the spiritual cleansing. You go through that. You set your intention. You prepare yourself, and then when you're in that hal, when you're in that state, then you have that communion with God, right? Because otherwise you're not ready. How are you going to benefit from it, right? So a writer has to have the same same kind of level of preparation as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So, what's the next milestone for Tales of Khayaal, and what else have you got that's coming up?
Yeah, so the first book obviously came out just a few weeks ago, and the second book is kind of about 30% through it, 40% through it. So inshallah, that should be out probably, hopefully by August, September. Yeah, so working on that right now. So we're kind of working through that. So that's kind of the book wise. What's happened since the launch? Uh, it's been very, I mean, very very fortunate. A lot of interesting interactions. We This week we actually became number one on the Ingram Spark Fantasy Action Adventure category. Like there's 100,000 books in that category. So I was with the publisher. We were checking the scoreboard yesterday, the dashboard. I was like, hang on a second, that says number one. Can you refresh that? And we refreshed it. And we realized on the Ingram Spark, amongst 100,000 books, we are number one right now. On Chapters, which is a audiobook app, I think they've had about nearly 3,000 downloads. There's been a lot of sales and so on. So there's been a lot of the community has the community, I think, around the world has really taken to the story well, and what that has led to in the last few weeks, we've had some approaches from some graphic novel organizations who do graphic novels with translation to different languages. So Peter's currently in negotiations with kind of a major player. We've had approaches from several video gamers, but there's one of the major brands that we're talking to right now. So again, that's kind of Peter's doing that right now. I'm just kind of in the conversation that's happening. So there might be like a video game coming. We've got some one of the big streaming platforms have approached us about doing some animation for young adult and above. So we're just getting that conversation going. RPG gaming, role playing games, board games. Several companies have approached us and said, look, and I think what people are appreciating is when they're coming to the story is the depth of it, the lore, the depth, the richness. And I think most of the people we're speaking to, they've read the book already. So they're that kind of like, fans now. And they're like, saying, we want this, we need to do this. Yeah. So I think that's what's happening really. And that's what Peter's role is, he's kind of doing all those things, working through, obviously we talk about it pretty much every day. But my head is down. What's the next word? What's the next word? I've got to do my minimum 1,000 words a day, ideally 1,500 words a day. So I keep my head down there, work on that, and then Peter does what he needs to do. So that's pretty much keeping us busy right now.
But you're doing some work with new writers as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Noor. So one thing that I think we're really mindful of is that this initiative, it's not just about Peter and I setting up this Tales of Khayaal and hey, great, we've been successful. What we're trying to do is we're trying to essentially create a livelihood for anyone out there who wants to plug into the ecosystem. So if we can start creating content which people are appreciating, they'll want more of it, which means you need more writers, right? Because I can't write everything. There's a whole lore of stuff that we could be doing here, right? Backstories, spin-off stories. I'm not going to do it all. But if there are great writers out there, we'll commission them. Illustrators, artists, animators. So suddenly, a lot of the people, especially in our community, who've been working for Disney, who've been working for Netflix, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they're now suddenly seeing a project which is, oh, this is really interesting. I'd like to do something here as well. So I think our intention is really about creating livelihoods for people who want to plug into the ecosystem. So as part of that, one thing I'm very mindful of is the lack of people from our community who are writing virtue-based novels. Okay. I've probably been to about 80, 90 schools around the world, right? And mainstream schools, but also faith-based schools. And whether I go to a Christian school or a Muslim school, often the teachers say to me, you know, there's not enough books that we're comfortable with the kids reading, right? And if you look at the Muslim writers right now who are writing, they're writing for primary school age primarily, yeah, which, alhamdulillah, is brilliant. Mainly sisters, right? Um, and that's the age group. There's very few people like yourself who are writing for older, for young adult, and adult, right? But the majority, probably 95%, are in primary, which is great. But guess what? Those kids are going to grow up. What are they going to read? so, so what we need to do is we need to train more people to do like what you're doing, which is writing for the older audience, right? And writing with that kind of virtue-based mindset. So the stories have that tarbiyah within them, and that as parents, that you're as a parent you're comfortable that, yeah, I know when I my kid watches this, right, it's okay. It's like back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, even if you let your kids watch something from Disney, it's okay, it's okay, right? Whereas maybe now some parents will, I'm not really sure about that, fine. So I think that's what we want to do. We want to kind of create more writers. So Peter and I have we've launched a program called essentially how to design a novel, because and it's really to teach you how to design your novel. It's not about how to write your novel, because one of the problems of a lot of the novels I read today is that the design process wasn't particularly done very well, and so the novel is not maybe what it should be, right? So we teach you really, how do you design setting, how do you design characters, how do you design plot. So it's a 5-week course, 2 hours per lesson over like 5 weeks, and there's like 5 lessons. And Yeah, so we're starting that on the 23rd of November. So if you have people who are listeners to that, would really excited to also announce that if all your listeners we're happy to give them a 10% discount on the course as well, and we'll put that into the I'm sure you'll put it into the show notes and stuff as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, Brother Rehan, it's been a pleasure having you. I feel like I've learned a lot from you. Alhamdulillah, it's added to my knowledge.
Alhamdulillah.
And hopefully I can get you back to talk about AI and writing and leadership and in books of characters and things. So, inshallah, hopefully there's
Inshallah.
lots more conversations coming up in the future.
Inshallah.
And with that, I'd like to bid the audience farewell. And as always, keep dreaming, keep writing, and let your story shine.